May 28, 1945, 9 a.m., Lienz, Austria. A British officer stands before 2,046 Cossack soldiers. His uniform is pressed, his posture is formal, his voice is calm. "Gentlemen," he says in Russian, "you are invited to an important conference with British command. You will return by 6 o'clock this evening." Some Cossacks exchange worried glances. They've heard rumors. The officer places his hand over his heart. "I assure you, on my word of honor as a British officer, that you are just going to a conference." The Cossacks believe him. They board the trucks willingly. No resistance, no weapons. Within hours, they will be handed directly to Stalin's NKVD executioners. Most will be dead within weeks. The British knew exactly where they were sending them. This is Operation Keelhaul, the forced repatriation of over 2 million Soviet refugees to certain death. And for 50 years, it remained classified, top secret, buried in archives stamped 383.7-14.1, because what the Allies did after winning World War II was, by their own Geneva Conventions, a war crime. To understand this betrayal, you have to go back to February 1945. Yalta Conference, the Crimean resort where Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin carved up post-war Europe. The official agenda: defeated Germany, the United Nations, the invasion of Japan. But Stalin had another demand. He wanted his people back. Every Soviet citizen in Allied custody. Every prisoner of war, every refugee, every defector. No exceptions. Churchill and Roosevelt faced a problem. The Red Army had liberated thousands of British and American POWs from German camps. Stalin was holding them hostage. The deal was simple. We give you yours, you give us ours. Both sides agreed. But there was a difference, a catastrophic, moral difference that would haunt the Allies for decades. British and American prisoners of war wanted to go home. Soviet citizens in Allied custody did not. They knew what awaited them in Stalin's Soviet Union. The Gulag, the firing squad, the labor camps in Siberia where temperatures dropped to -50 degrees Celsius and survival was measured in months. Stalin himself had declared it. Any Soviet soldier captured by the Germans was a traitor. Surrender was treason. So when the Allies began rounding up Soviet refugees in 1945, they weren't just sending soldiers home. They were sending them to die. And they knew it. Among those marked for repatriation were the Cossacks, not Soviet citizens, not collaborators. White Russian émigrés who had fled the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, nearly 30 years earlier. They had never lived under Soviet rule. Many held foreign passports. Some had been born in exile, but Stalin wanted them anyway, and Churchill gave them to him. By May 1945, roughly 50,000 Cossacks had retreated into Austria with their families. Women, children, elderly. They were fleeing both the Germans and the advancing Red Army. British forces intercepted them near the town of Lienz. The Cossacks surrendered peacefully. They had no reason to fear the British. Britain had fought the Bolsheviks in 1918. Surely they would offer asylum. The British fed them, sheltered them, assigned them to camps along the Drave River. For 3 weeks, the Cossacks waited. Then on May 28th, British officers arrived with an invitation. The Cossack officers were told to report to a conference. British command wanted to discuss their future. Some were suspicious. But a British captain gave his word of honor. You are just going to a conference. They boarded the trucks. The convoy didn't go to a conference. It went straight to Judenburg, the Soviet occupation zone. When the truck stopped, NKVD soldiers were waiting. The Cossack officers realized what was happening. Some tried to escape. British soldiers forced them back at gunpoint. Others began killing themselves, jumping from moving trucks, stabbing themselves with hidden knives. By the time they reached the handover point, several were already dead. The rest were transferred to Soviet custody. General Pyotr Krasnov, General Andrei Shkuro, Ataman of the Don Cossacks, leaders who had fought Bolshevism for 3 decades. They were taken to Moscow's Lubyanka prison. On January 16, 1947, they were hanged. Back in Lienz, The remaining 32,000 Cossacks, soldiers, women, children, still didn't know. On the morning of May 29th, British soldiers surrounded the camps. Loudspeakers blared announcements in Russian. Your officers lied to you. You are all being sent back to the Soviet Union. Panic erupted. Families clutched each other. Mothers grabbed their children. Old men dropped to their knees. Then the British moved in. What happened next would be described by witnesses as a scene from hell. Cossacks threw themselves into the Drave River. Dozens drowned trying to escape. Others hanged themselves from trees, using whatever rope they could find. Parents killed their own children rather than let them face Stalin's camps. One witness, Olga Rotova, later testified, more than 700 Cossacks were dead as a result of those operations, either crushed underfoot, killed by the British, or committed suicide. British soldiers, ordered to load the refugees onto cattle cars, used rifle butts and bayonets. They dragged screaming women by their hair. They pried children from their mothers' arms. Some British troops refused. They wept. They looked away. They accidentally left gaps in the perimeter so refugees could escape. But most followed orders. 22,502 Cossacks were packed into sealed cattle cars. The trains departed for the Soviet zone. During the journey, more suicides. People stabbed themselves, jumped from moving trains, smashed their heads against the walls. When the trains crossed into Soviet territory, NKVD officers took over. Many Cossacks were executed immediately, shot on the platform without trial. The rest were sent to the Gulag. Almost none survived. Lienz was not an isolated incident. Operation Keelhaul occurred across Europe, Italy, Germany, France, Denmark, Norway, even Sweden. American forces participated. At Fort Dix, New Jersey, 154 Soviet nationals who had been promised asylum were forced aboard a Soviet ship. 3 committed suicide before boarding. 7 were injured resisting. The remaining prisoners, when loaded onto the ship, rioted and dismantled the engines with their bare hands. American soldiers responded by mixing barbiturates into the prisoners' coffee. They loaded the unconscious men onto the ship while they were in drug-induced comas. The ship sailed for the Soviet Union. In total, an estimated 2 to 5 million people were forcibly repatriated between 1944 and 1947. Most were Soviet POWs, men who had surrendered to the Germans and were now considered traitors. Others were forced laborers, civilians kidnapped by the Nazis for factory work. Still others were refugees, families fleeing westward ahead of the Red Army. And some, like the Cossacks, had never been Soviet citizens at all. All were sent back. The Allies knew what awaited them. One American diplomat, acting Secretary of State Joseph Grew, wrote a memo in February 1945 warning that forced repatriation violated the Geneva Convention. His memo was ignored. Eisenhower himself eventually ordered a halt, but not until 1947, after millions had already been sent. In September 1948, the U.S. Army classified all records related to Operation Keelhaul, 3 volumes of documents, stamped top secret, filed under number 3.7-14.1. Britain did the same. For decades, the operation remained unknown. Churchill's war memoirs mention it briefly, a few paragraphs. He frames it as a necessary exchange of prisoners. Nothing more. The soldiers who participated were told not to speak about it. The refugees who escaped, those few who managed to hide in the Austrian mountains, told stories that no one believed. Then, in 1954, a researcher named Julius Epstein stumbled onto a reference in a government archive. Forcible repatriation of Soviet citizens, Operation Keelhaul. Classified. Epstein spent 20 years fighting to access those files. He sued the U.S. government. He petitioned. He wrote letters. Finally, in 1973, the documents were declassified. His book, Operation Keelhaul, The Story of Forced Repatriation from 1944 to the Present, was the first public account. Alexander Solzhenitsyn called it the last secret of World War II. Here is the most bitter irony. While Operation Keelhaul was underway, forcibly returning Soviet refugees to Stalin, Britain was simultaneously running Operation Fling, a program to help Soviet defectors escape from the Soviet Union. MI6 was actively recruiting anti-Soviet agents, retaining prisoners who could be useful for intelligence, hiding them from Stalin's repatriation commissions. Churchill himself ordered certain prisoners kept back for anti-Soviet operations, so the British were selectively choosing who deserved freedom and who deserved death. Useful defectors, asylum. Everyone else, the Gulag. The Americans did the same. The 14th Waffen Grenadier Division, recruited from Ukrainians, was not repatriated. Not because Galicia had belonged to Poland, but because MI6 wanted to use them. The decision wasn't legal. It was expedient. Protect the ones we need, sacrifice the rest. After declassification, the official justification emerged. We were following the Yalta Agreement. But historians found a problem. The Yalta Agreement called for repatriation of Soviet citizens. It said nothing about using force. It specifically applied only to citizens as of September 1st, 1939, after the Soviet invasion of Poland. The Cossacks didn't qualify. The White Russian émigrés didn't qualify. Refugees from pre-1939 territories didn't qualify. And yet they were sent back anyway. Why? Because Stalin demanded it. And the Allies didn't want to anger him. The war with Germany was over, but the Allies still needed Soviet cooperation for the invasion of Japan, for the occupation of Germany, for the new United Nations. So they appeased him. With human lives. One captain wrote 50 years later, "We were told not to use force and forbidden to inform them of their true destination. When they asked us where they were going, we replied that we were transferring them to another British camp. The prisoners could see the partisans through cracks in the boarding and began hammering on the insides of the wagons, shouting abuse at us for having betrayed them, lied to them, and sentenced at least the men among them to a grotesque death." Another officer described it simply. "The NKVD or the Gestapo would have slain us with truncheons. The British did it with their word of honor." In the 1950s, after Stalin's death, some survivors were released. A Soviet newspaper editorial noted, "All their sins have been forgiven," as if being captured by the Germans was a sin requiring forgiveness. Those who survived the gulags, skeletal, broken, traumatized, returned to find their families gone, their homes demolished, their names erased from records. Many simply vanished again. The Cossacks who escaped Lienz, those few who hid in the mountains who were sheltered by sympathetic Austrians, lived the rest of their lives in exile. Some settled in the United States, some in Canada, some in Argentina. They remembered. In Lienz, a small cemetery marks the site. 18 gravestones, a plaque. Tragedy of the Drow. Every year, a memorial service is held. Fewer attend each year. Today, Operation Keelhaul is barely taught. It doesn't fit the narrative. The Allies were the good guys. They liberated Europe. They defeated fascism. How do you reconcile that with forcing women and children into cattle cars? With lying to refugees and handing them to executioners? With sedating prisoners and shipping them unconscious to the Gulag? The answer? You don't talk about it. In 1995, the James Bond film GoldenEye referenced the Lienz Cossacks. The villain, Alec Trevelyan, is the son of repatriated Cossacks who survived Stalin's execution squads but were so traumatized that his father killed his mother, then himself. Trevelyan's vendetta against Britain is rooted in that betrayal. Bond's response, "Not exactly our finest hour." That's the closest popular culture has come to acknowledging it. This is what makes Operation Keelhaul so haunting. It wasn't carried out by Nazis. It wasn't ordered by dictators. It was carried out by democracies, by soldiers who believed in freedom, by governments that claimed to fight for human rights. And they did it anyway, because politics demanded it, because Stalin wanted it, because it was easier than saying no. The Geneva Convention existed. The rules were clear. The moral lines were drawn, and the Allies crossed them. Not in the heat of battle, Not under duress. Churchill knew, Roosevelt knew, Eisenhower knew, and they classified it, buried it, kept it secret for 50 years. Because some truths are too uncomfortable to acknowledge. Some victories require too many compromises. Some heroes commit acts they can never defend. May 28, 1945. 6 p.m. The Cossack officers do not return to Lienz. At the camp, families wait. Children ask where their fathers are. By nightfall, the rumors begin. By morning, they know. And 3 days later, when the British soldiers arrive with bayonets and cattle cars, the Cossacks understand what liberation means. Not freedom, betrayal. The British fought a war to stop totalitarianism, and then they handed 2 million people to Stalin. In 2010, Russia officially rehabilitated the Cossacks. A statement acknowledged they were unjustly persecuted. No apology, just acknowledgement. Britain has never issued a formal apology for Lienz. Neither has the United States for Fort Dix. The files are declassified now. The historians have written their books. The survivors, those few still alive, have told their stories. But in school textbooks, Operation Keelhaul is a footnote. In popular memory, it barely exists. Because this is the story we don't tell about World War II. The good guys won. But victory required a price, and sometimes that price was paid by people who trusted us, who thought the Allies would protect them. They were wrong. And for 50 years, we made sure no one knew.